So I invite to the floor the next speakers who are going to speak about appraisal of digital information. So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
So yeah, when we meet with Yves, we were like, at the very bottom of the curve, and you see where we are now. And that's our information governance world as you all know it. It's like you've heard about the storage capacity development rules set up by Moore, and we just have more and more of this storage. And it's not only about the creation of the content, it's on the volume, it's also the typology, the type of contents we have. And this graph is showing you also the typical type of people who are becoming contributors to information we have to manage as information professionals. And the business data remain the small part. Yeah, go ahead. The last thing around the development of our data world is also the fact that it's not only about the volume, it's not only about the source, the origin, who is producing data, but because we have more and more transaction, we keep talking about transaction, we need to track transaction for compliance purpose, we need to document those, you know that's one of the basic rules of records management. We are more and more exposed, and we have more and more to share what we are doing. And because of sharing, we are exposing ourselves. And we have concerns, obviously, around the personal data protection. You heard all of that. Here's a graph. I really advise you to look at the website. What you see is not the reality. I did some filter on this graph. It's even worse. But what's interesting is think about all the records management programs that have started again, and for companies that are showing on this screen. And it's very interesting to see how people interact with data, and when something happened to them, suddenly their program is like a new kickoff. Yep. So to tackle with this volume, with this variety of typology of records and the additional risk and exposure of our contents to various people, our role as records manager has really evolved, and we can't do stuff manually anymore. It doesn't make sense. You all know that. And we need to be able to process information in bulks, and we need to be able to manage those flows and have some governance around it. So when earlier we were talking about transferring or having the retention management, you were talking about the record continuum just a minute ago. There's all this aspect of governance. This is absolutely right. They need to be there at the beginning. When we talk about privacy by design, it's exactly the same logic behind it. To do that, we need to be able also to take benefit of the technology to help us to do these activities. We talk about blockchain this morning and how it could help us to guarantee integrity of some transaction we need to track. But there are also other technology that we can use to be able to react on what is important, what is the key information we need to keep and we need to preserve. And because the business is changing and evolving over time, how many companies have merger and acquisitions, how you've seen my title, how many companies are suddenly changing type of business. And as information professional, we need to be able to tackle with this type of things and use technology to help us to do that. And when we look at the environment, there was like no good principle or no good standard that was really holistically responding to those needs. And that's the reason why Yves started with the University of Ottawa this research to be able to see how we can have a kind of global and complete and holistic approach around information and take all the concerns around the life cycle management, the protection of privacy, the tier storage or retiring of data, from the IT governance side, and operational needs. Suddenly, a strategist may need information that was considered obsolete, or you may have no retention requirements, and you need to keep this information for a certain period of time. So we wanted to develop a model around that, and that's what the research Yves started resulted in. So in 2015, the team, Inge, what's her name? Alberts and Yves started to model and look at what was available in the literature around all the information models and how information was assessed and values of information. Once they designed the model, they started I'll show you this example then. They started, the way they designed the model was really based on both looking at the research and also collecting information and knowledge from practitioners, so from business representatives. So they got interviews with those people to understand how the real life is, how these people are managing information. And in parallel, they dig out also all those business processes, books that some corporate companies have, and that document how the corporate functions. And based on that, they designed the model, start to test it with data last year, and it's still ongoing. And hopefully, once the algorithm is fully tested, it should be deployed as of spring next year. And now I'll hand over to Yves, so you can really see how this real-time assessment of information can be implemented in your real life. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So that was Elizabeth's 4 minute, which is probably now 10 minutes. So I'll try to do a 1 hour presentation in 10 minutes. So maybe if I speak too fast, just slow me down. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is how we came up with this, or the model we came up with to assess the value of information, because we think that one of the biggest problems that we encounter when we try to assess information is that the value of the information that we have is very hard to assess. So we try to come up with a model where that can be done fairly automatically. So one thing that we realize first is that the value of information fluctuates over time. So some information the value might decrease over time. Other information based on different criteria, so like users, things like that, might actually increase over time. So we try to keep that in mind when we develop that model. So the first thing we did is come up with a value taxonomy. So we found that there's actually 3 aspects in assessing the value of information. The first one is a critical value, which represents the legal aspect, essential aspects, and confidential aspect of the information. I'm going very fast, so I have a little table at the back here, so if you want to ask questions after, you can come and see me, but because we probably won't have time for any questions. The second aspect is strategic value of information. So that is really represents how information is important for things like business intelligence, risk mitigation, and performance measurement. And the third one is a operational component. So really, what do we need to run the business processes in the organization? So some information is crucial for running business processes, but might not be as important after the business process is over. So, and the other thing that we realize also is that the value is stratified. So it's compounded value. So these three aspects can add up. So we came up with a way to assess information to give it a grade on 1 to 100. So that's what we did there. And we also have determined some information value criteria. So what is going to influence the value? So the first thing that we realize is that there are some criteria that are intrinsic to the value. So that means that they are there at the beginning. So if I create, I don't know, an annual report for a corporation, if it's a financial statements, I already know the value of that information. So I can do an initial assessment of that information. In some cases, for other types of information, it's very difficult to do. So there's contextual information that is required to influence the value of these other types of information. So there are many value criteria that we can apply. There are some genre-based things like the genre importance, the type of action that people are carrying over, the classification level, the accession record status, the legality of information. There are process-based value criteria, the creator authority, the origin of the information, the business important, the role of the information resource, if it's an input or an output to the process, the project type that it's related to, or the project status. And finally, there are usage-based criteria that are really important. Things like a number of access, when was the last access to the information, the role of the audience, the origin of the audience, the diversity, the usage and scope of the information, and finally, again, some legality. So the first one would be something that would be predetermined. The second one would be things like access to information or litigation, things like that. So things that would influence the value of information in time. So what we're seeing now is that some of these value criteria are static. So the one in blue are things that can be predetermined. Okay? The one that you see in yellow are actually dynamic criteria. So those will change over time. Okay? So if we transpose that into some kind of a graph like that, I'll try to slow down a little bit. Okay, so just to show you how it works a little bit, is that here on the left I have three information objects, or whatever you want to call them. And if you look, those are the different stratum of information. So you see the first one as values in the tree. The second one might be just operational and process related. So, and at start, because there's a preliminary analysis that is done based on business processes, these types of information can have a value. So you see one is 100%, the other one is 60%, the other one is 50%, okay? So now on that, we can apply a template that will dictate us on how things will behave over time. So if you look, the first thing is that we have a black dotted line and a red dotted line. So those would be thresholds that are put there. So what we would say is that if the black threshold there, information goes above that level, it then becomes an official record that has to be preserved over time for the organization, okay? If it stays under the black, it's just peripheral information that is not that important to the organization. Also at the bottom, you have the lower threshold, where information that goes below that level is considered as not being required anymore, or junk or whatever, okay? So what you will see is information will fluctuate into that model. You also have 1 point of declaration as a record. So if information goes above the black line, and let's say it's still in a draft mode, what we do is we predetermine a period where the information, even if somebody doesn't do an action of declaring that as a record, it will be done automatically, okay? And there are different templates that could be applied to that, and these thresholds can vary by organization. So what will happen is that as the time goes by, like if you look at the second year, what we do is at the beginning, we apply a rate of depreciation to the information. So over time, the value will decrease, okay? And if you look at information that is not over the top threshold, the rate of depreciation can be more aggressive. So that information that is not important will disappear faster. The one above, it will retain its value until it's declared as a record. And as soon as it's declared as a record, then it will start depreciating. So what we'll see happening is that you'll see that the value keeps on at 100% until it's declared as a record. You see that something happened here. The second one went from 60% to 42%, and suddenly it went up to 85%. So that means that this information that at the beginning was considered as not being too important was accessed many times, probably by important people, was used to support business cases or whatever. So these factors beefed up the value of the information, and suddenly it passed that threshold, the over 80%, and it's now going to be considered as an official record of the organization, right? So over time, you'll see at your information, and you see that the third one there went down from 50 to 30, and suddenly it went below the red line. So at that point, it can be disposed of if you want, okay? And over time, that will continue like that, and some information at a certain point can go up a little bit. So that means that some information might be kept a bit longer than was planned for initially, because if you have something that is a official record of the organization, it was supposed to be disposed in 5 years, and suddenly at 4 years, a lot of activity happened, then it might push it up a little bit, so to be kept for a year or two more. The other thing that you can do with that model is that you can design an area where you say, okay, anything within the blue area that is below a certain value over time will go into offline storage. So if you want to offload your systems, you can put that. So the nice thing, just 2 minutes left. So the nice thing about that is that this whole model can be automated. What we have done, we have a system that actually manages all of that. So we have our C3 information governance software that tags information automatically. And what happens when people access information, we take into account all of these things. So you have these values that I was talking about, the strategic value, operational value, critical value. So that will be changed in real time as people are dealing with the information. And suddenly, after that, what you can do is report on that. So you can have a graphical representation. You can actually go and see for a division, and you can see, okay, this division has, I don't know, 80% of their information, which is a very high value. The rest is not very important. This other organization, most of the information is very high value. And it can also be used for things like knowledge management. And we have a way to apply the same methodology to tacit knowledge and also structured knowledge. That was a challenge. So where we are right now is that we have developed the whole system. We have large clients like the Canadian federal government. And what we're doing is we're collecting all that information in the background. And what we'll be doing just after the January period, we'll be assessing if the algorithms behave in the way they're supposed to behave. So we'll audit the information and verify with the client if they perceive that the information has been assigned the right value by the system. Thank you, everyone.
So thank you for the speakers. I really impressed this approach. I think that it has some limits, of course, with all of these, but I really impressed that some automation processes can support appraisal of the records, the companies.
Well, nothing's perfect. Compromises have to be made. We're trying to be pragmatic because it's better to do something that is not 100% perfect than not to do anything. Huh?
I fully agree.
Yeah. So if you destroy the records, which according to the factors evaluated as destroyable, you cannot get it back.
If it reaches 10%, you might not destroy. You might archive it at that point. Okay, it's just that it's not active within the organization at that point. Okay, but for information that has never reached the record status, that is past its life cycle, then it can be destroyed.
I just tell a very short story in my experience that in Hungary and other former communist countries, during the communist period, many properties were confiscated by the states from the people. And we made a compensation based on those records, which should have been destroyed for years. But we didn't have time in the archive to destroy those records. And after 1990, we used those records for supporting the compensation process.
Yeah, that's why it's important to manage information from its creation point. That's what we believe, is that there's so much information these days that you can't accumulate information and process it after. So we have to take action at creation point and manage it through its life cycle and be very proactive with that.
So thank you again for
You're
the
welcome.
presentation.